delighted to be invited here. I'm having a wonderful time. The weather has held up, which is always very good and is very important in Dylan Thomas. He had an eye for weather. I always loved his relish for rhyme and rollicking verse that appealed at a very early age to me, and it's been exciting and gratifying to be around people talking about his work and also reading from some of our own work and enjoying just being together in the place that his wife Kathleen came from, because a lot of the time people concentrate on the negativities of his life, that he died at 39, that he was a drunk, but what this festival will do is remind everybody about his huge and immense talent, and I hope put Ennistymon back on the literary map where it should be. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm the O'Connor branch of the firm here, Clairr O'Connor, and thank you, Paul, for your brief and witty introduction. I'm having a lovely time in Ennistymon. We arrived yesterday afternoon, and as I was coming in the entrance, Fred Johnston was on the steps near the very friendly lions, so I patted the lions, nodded to Fred, came in, met Joanne, met Barbara, and had a lovely evening last night and a lovely morning today. So I hope I can entertain you this afternoon. Is that okay?
I think it's fine. Can you get as close as you can?
I can. I'll just slightly angle it. Is that okay? Can I be heard? Yeah.
I'll stay here.
Okay. My godmother, Clarissa Lambourne, sent me a copy of A Child's Christmas in Wales when I was 12. I was delighted with the antics of the boy and his friend Jim in this prose piece. There was drama and hyperbole. Long, long ago, when there were wolves in Wales, the snow seemed to come for Christmas, as if ordered in. When fire broke out in the Prothero house the afternoon of Christmas Eve, Mrs. Prothero shouted, "Fire!" and "Ruin!" while banging on a gong, like the town crier in ancient Pompeii. Mr. Prothero waved his slipper about ineffectually at smoke clouds. The firemen came. Then, as 3 tall firemen stood around amongst the cinders and smoke, Jim's Aunt Prothero, who, according to Dylan Thomas, always said the right thing, asked the firemen, "Would you like anything to read?" Humour, gusto, and keen observation of character pervades the piece. He can't remember whether it snowed for 6 or 12 days. Dylan Thomas and his friend Jim consider posting a snowball through a neighbour's letterbox, or perhaps writing on his snowy lawn, "Mr. Daniel looks like a spaniel." The postman delivers seasonal presents. Aunts and uncles indulge in Christmas food and drink. Aunt Hannah puts rum in her tea because it was only once a year. Later in life, as a teacher in London and Ireland, I enjoyed teaching Fern Hill, the death by fire of a child in London, and of course his wonderful villanelle for his dying father, "Do not go gentle into that good night." I put on a reading of Under Milkwood with my 6th form students, and they relished it. High praise indeed. As a writer of radio plays myself, I appreciated his skill in hooking the listener from the very first word and holding on to them to the last. His sense of humour and force of energy was huge. The fictional village, Clare, this is pronounced with a Welsh accent, in Under Milkwood, read it backwards and it spells bugger all. The facts of his short life, he died just a month after he was 39, they are dramatic and sensational. the heavy drinker, the womanizer, the fraught relationship with his wife Kathleen, the careless father, but he left behind huge gifts too. He is often thought of as a maverick poet, an outsider, as if he sprung from nowhere. I want to challenge that view of him today and place at least one important aspect of his work within the long tradition of literature, both celebrating and also mourning childhood. So I've entitled this little talk, Remembering Childhood, Dylan Thomas. Dylan Thomas's childhood was one of the great animators of his imagination. His young self haunted his adulthood. In his poem called Poem in October, written when he was only 30, he was already mourning his infancy. The twice-told fields of infancy, his tears burned my cheeks and his heart moved in mine. Remembering childhood is a major theme in literature in English, and it has gone through extraordinary mutations from generation to generation and epoch to epoch. Wordsworth says that the great poet is the writer who preserves the child whole within himself. And in his poem, Ode on the Intimations of Immortality, he tries to recapture the radiant innocence of childhood. There was a time when meadow, grove and stream, the earth and every common sight, to me did seem apparelled in celestial light, the glory and the freshness of a dream. For Wordsworth, the soul pre-exists the child's arrival in the world, an idea that derives ultimately from Plato. I won't say much about Plato and his problems, but what he wanted to solve with this idea was two things. Firstly, the immortality of the soul, and secondly, the knowledge human beings have of what he calls the forms, such as unity, beauty, justice, etc. Things we never actually meet except in a degraded form in this world. The fact that we know what they are, Plato argues, indicates that we must have a memory of them when we pre-existed our earthly sojourn in a higher world. Of course, Aristotle disagreed with Plato's view, and I leave you to adjudicate between the two. But Wordsworth expressed this idea in his great ode. The soul that rises with us, our life's star, hath had elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar. Not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come, from God who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. This last line, heaven lies about us in our infancy, could be a summary of the main current of feeling in Dylan Thomas's great ode to childhood, Fern Hill, when he says, "Now, as I was young and easy, under the apple boughs, about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes." I'll say a little more about this poem later. Another great Welsh poet from the 17th century, Henry Vaughan, celebrates a very similar vision of childhood in his poem called The Retreat. He says, "Happy those early days when I shined in my angel infancy, before I understood this place, appointed for my second race, or taught my soul to fancy aught but a white celestial thing." Vaughan describes the long fall from grace and dreams in the end of returning to his prelapsarian innocence. "Some men a forward motion love, but I by backward steps would move, and when this dust falls to the urn, in that state I came, return." What is striking about these visions of childhood is how infused they are with light, with a golden glow, with timelessness, and to a greater or lesser extent, with a sense of loss. I will give you one more brief extract in this rich stream of literature in English. It is from the 17th century poet and theologian, Thomas Traherne's Rhapsody on Childhood, and how the child views the world. The corn was orient and immortal wheat, which never should be reaped, nor ever was sown. I thought it had stood from everlasting to everlasting. The dust and stones of the street were as precious as gold. The gates were at first the end of the world. The green trees, when I saw them first through one of the gates, transported and ravished me. There were such strange and wonderful things. Boys and girls tumbling in the streets and playing were moving jewels. I knew not that they were born or should die. Eternity was manifest in the light of the day, and something infinite behind everything appeared, which talked with my expectation and moved my desire. He finishes this paragraph as follows: so that with much ado I was corrupted and made to learn the dirty devices of this world, which I now unlearn, and becomes, as it were, a little child again, that I may enter into the kingdom of God. This comes from Thomas Traherne's Centuries of Meditations. Traherne was born in Hertford on the River Wye, a few miles from the Welsh border. He went to Oxford and took holy orders. His work has been described as the ecstatic harmony of a child with the natural world. But only one of his works, Roman Forgeries, was published in his lifetime. Traherne's vision of childhood in his writings is thought to have been influenced by Henry Vaughan's The Retreat that I mentioned and quoted from earlier. He also influenced Thomas Merton, Dorothy L. Sayers, Elizabeth Jennings, and C.S. Lewis. Lewis called Traherne's Centuries of Meditations almost the most beautiful book in English. I feel that Dylan Thomas must have read it too. Most people will have come across Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales that I mentioned. He dashed it off for the BBC radio for much needed money. The prose piece teems with relatives observed with wonder and amusement. Some few large men sat in the front parlours with their collars, or without their collars rather, uncles almost certainly trying their new cigars, holding them out judiciously at arm's length, returning them to their mouths, coughing, then holding them out again as though waiting for an explosion. And some few small ants, not wanted in the kitchen, nor anywhere else for that matter, sat on the very edge of their chairs, poised and brittle, afraid to break, like faded cups and saucers. It is also full of images of snow, animals, glittering stars, the ice cream hills and the crackling sea. It contains echoes for every one of us of remembered childhood Christmases, the sense of infinite variety, but also repetition. Looking through my bedroom window, out into the moonlight and the unending smoke-filled coloured snow, I could see the lights in the windows of all the other houses on our hill, and hear the music rising from them up the long, steady falling night. I turned the gas down. I got into bed. I said some words to the close and holy darkness, and then I slept. The quintessential childhood poem by Dylan Thomas is, of course, Fern Hill, and John F. Dean read it in its entirety this morning, so I'll read a little bit from it just so we can recapture it. It opens with, "Now as I was young and easy, under the apple boughs, about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb, golden in the heydays of his eyes. And honoured among wagons, I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. And as I was green and carefree, famous among the barns, about the happy yard, and singing as the farm was home." The Fern Hill poem is suffused with light, green and golden. The boy escapes the chains of time and lives in a sunlit eternity. In those images, Dylan Thomas participates in the long tradition of the childhood memory poem. In the sun born over and over, I ran my heedless ways. In this poem, of course, the glory of childhood is immanent and in the moment itself, and does not derive from a memory of a pre-existent light, as I mentioned earlier. Yet the imagery and the expressive mode show a clear continuity with the 17th century mystical tradition and the 19th century romantic movement, as I quoted from Wordsworth earlier. I'll refer to one other Dylan Thomas poem, his poem In October, with its wonderful imaginative return to the locale of his childhood and the transformative vision of the child's eye. His inner weather turns from his 30-year-old self to the child he was. It turned away from the blithe country and down the other air and the blue altered sky, streamed again a wonder of summer with apples, pears and red currants. And I saw in the turning so clearly a child's forgotten mornings when he walked with his mother through the parables of sunlight and the legends of the green chapels. And the twice told fields of infancy that his tears burned my cheeks and his heart moved in mine. These were the woods and the river and the sea, where a boy in the listening summertime of the dead whispered the truth of his joy to the trees and the stones and the fish and the tide. And the mystery sang alive, still in the water and singing birds. And there could I marvel my birthday away, but the weather turned around. And the true joy of the long-dead child sang, burning in the sun. It was my 30th year to heaven, stood there then in the summer noon, though the town below lay leaved with October blood. Oh, may my heart's truth still be sung on this high hill in a year's turning. He mentions the chapel, green chapels there, and I feel a lot of his language that feels rousing and wonderful to us comes from the chapel tradition in Wales of sermons. It's odd to think that just 18 years, though, after Dylan Thomas's death, that Philip Larkin could so revise the vision of childhood in his short poem, This Be the Verse. This Be the Verse by Philip Larkin. They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. Of course, this was after the invention of teenagers in the late 50s and 60s. Nowadays, our vision of childhood in Ireland has been brutally contaminated by the revelations of recent years, and it is something that we must have to face up to. This is a poem of my own called A Maze. Navigating the box hedge labyrinth, he comes again upon the angry teenager with avocado hair, his metal braces clinking against the Coke tin. He wants to backtrack to the wooden gazebo, if only he can remember the way out. The boy's earphones leak tinny violence. His tongue feels out a tiny deposit of scrambled egg and watercress on his back teeth. He swallows. Nobody walks here except himself, his staff, the clerical students. How did this alien gain entrance? He mustn't go near him. The files in his study pack his waking hours, break each night's sleep. His old age contaminated by knowledge, gatekeeper to truth, lies, and canon law. He turns his back on the boy, walks fast in the other direction. There's a scream in his head, a pulse in his temple. The box hedge closes in. Like driving all night towards morning, he pushes on, in need of returning light. I'm now going to read some further poems of my own, some of them connected to what I've previously said about childhood and just different views of it. This poem, called Pilgrim, is set in the 13th century, England, 1250 to be precise, a time when it was mostly believed that God, yes, he was in heaven, and the emperor or king held sway on earth. The persona in the poem is a high-born married woman who goes on pilgrimage to Canterbury, longing for a child. I am already in my chamber, the night shift laid out by my attendant. We have made the daylight count, pressing on, 2 changes of horses. We sped past the waymarks till our retinue reached the postern in the city. No pilgrim's hospice for us, my Lord would not permit it. Instead, we dwell with his kinsman, our protector for this time. His welcome dress is sharp. Try not to mingle with the evildoers or jostle with the mob. They clog the cathedral close with their public piety, sour-smelling hair shots, and cheap pilgrims' pendants. The road to paradise is full of skinned knees and bent backs. My hood is still up, my gloves on, while his eyes mock me. I refuse sweetmeats and wine, the lure of the lyre and company at table. Profess full fatigue, the need to cleanse myself. He bows low, returns to his dais. A servant brings water to my chamber, lights the cressets and candles. My attendant sees to the rest, lays out my brown penitent's garb and coarse sandals for the morrow. She brushes my long locks. Now I shine like a tabernacle. I hear the horses feeding. Soon the boy snores in the stable loft. Tomorrow I will circle Becket's shrine, breathe prayers onto my beads, ask our Lord and his mother Mary to give me the son my Lord needs for his domain. This next poem presents love and childbirth in a very different milieu. What savage cannot dance? At first, like stones across a river, we made a way for each other. Waterfalls of looks our alphabet. We hurried, breathless to please, never stopping or looking back. Higher we climbed, sun-scorched and heady. A whole range of mountains was ours, the one between our countries. When you came to my village, the welcome words meant nothing to you. You knelt with me, our eyes closed before the magic serpent. Later, the tent, the wild goats, flowers and our cooking pot, you knew by touch, by colour. When the child ripped me, you painted your face with the elders, danced the fire-birth dance, ate the smoking knives. What we remember from our childhood can often condense around one image. This is a poem about my mother. It's called Her Hands. My mother had clever hands, making patchwork quilts, children's clothes, breads, scones, cakes. My first memory is of those hands, lifting me to sky, never to feel as exhilarated or safe again. Those hands, the cathedral of my childhood. In my teens, I scoffed at her housewifery. Her favourite word was wife. Her hands, the practical romance of the marriage. My father's hands, in clouds only she could see. Most of my life has been spent in a classroom, so I've always had an interest in educational theorists. And this poem is called Thérèse and JJ. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, wrote a book called Émile about the perfect education of a boy. Of course, at that time, girls weren't even considered worth educating. I often wondered what the mother of his many children felt about how he related to his own offspring. This poem is written from the point of view of Thérèse de Valleur, his longtime mistress, later his wife. Thérèse and JJ. I didn't know where to look that first time he came to table, handsome and so well-spoken, and always with a book about him, or scribbling on a page. I hadn't time for book learning even before Papa left the mint at Orléans, or Maman's business went bust. She put me to minding young ones of the neighbourhood. When all pockets were empty, I tended him at table. The landlady, Madame, was full of airs, but in truth rough enough as were those who slept in her house. They laughed at the filthy jokes the Gascons told and teased if I objected. Only Rousseau took my part and made them colour in shame. Oh, how I loved him then. Ah, my Thérèse, he said, and I was his forever. No expectation of marriage. He made that clear from the start. I would have swallowed oceans or walked blazing coals had he asked. When the time came for the baby, Maman and Jean-Jacques took me to Mademoiselle Guyon. I didn't like the look of that mouth no one had kissed. He did not glance back, but danced his way from the door with a speed that seemed to slap and fight with the birth pains before the baby came. Then I held my newborn in the light of fire flames until sleep overwhelmed me. Awake again, I learned my son was already at the foundling hospital. She had no pity. Was it not what was agreed with Monsieur Rousseau, Mademoiselle? She said with a smile that stretched her mouth with pleasure. 5 times Mademoiselle Guyon took my babies from me. Each time I begged him, could I not keep one of ours? My ghost children haunted me. When he told Grimm, Diderot, and Madame d'Epinay, his face did not burn with shame. Conviction made him proud. He gave his children to the state. They would become peasants, not enfeebled bourgeois. A citizen doing his duty. The last baby was conceived the night of the robbery. On Christmas Eve, when Maman and I returned from Vespers, alive with hosannas and alleluias, we found a thief had visited. My jewel box was gone, and 42 of Jean-Jacques' finest linen shirts, the ones he cherished from Venice. A neighbour gave a description of my elder brother, but Maman would have none of it, though we never saw him again. My box held my first communion pearls and a birthstone ring, my godmother's gifts to me. He came in later, all aglow from some discussion with Diderot and Grimm. He had the better of them, he boasted, but his pleasure was soon punctured. I took off his boots then, told him of the theft. I see him now, me at his feet, tugging at the second high boot when he shouted, "All!" then wept like a baby. I'm going to read a couple of recent poems that are more concerned with the end of the life rather than its beginnings now. Murmurations. We must allow one another to be sad sometimes, he said that first dusk when starlings gathered and swarmed, stripped the bushes of the last fruit, ate animal feed from the troughs. Afterwards, a silence not like in cities. They dug into their new life, new country, collected sacred water from Catholic wells and shrines, sprinkled its protection in every corner of the house like their neighbours. In time, they forgot their own language. The local dialect murmured between them, even in intimacy. Decades passed. They leaned into each other, the landscape. Each spring, sleep-deprived from February to May, they ran to the lambing sheds. Gloved, they pulled the hind legs of a new lamb out, breathing again only when the mother licked it. The day he died, she dismantled the lambing sheds, whooshing creatures onto a startled neighbour's land, determined as an ancient to appease the gods by throwing valuables into a sacred river. Now her life feels oversized. She's beginning to remember her first language, does not yet know she wants to be somewhere else. Her dreams swarm with starlings. Another world. That weekend we sped west and south to a friend not quite at the tip of the island. Later we stood in her bog sculpture garden, haloed in the first strong sun of the year, shadowed by the ancient ravelled figures she had pulled from peat while they were still sleeping. Now they watched the dappled bog and stone with us, as if we and they should be clothed in hemp and skins. That mountain range shot through its blue-black greens and browns with amber light just borrowed from the sun. The firs blazed its prickly gold. It blinded the timid purples of the heather as you aimed your camera lens. 2 counties hence, your mother lay in bed, counting the hesitant days of her 91st year. The shop bought roses of our visit, already fallen to the floor. I'll finish with a short poem that I wrote in memory of my godmother, Clarissa Lambourne, because children benefit also from the generosity of others, not in the tribe. It's called What She Left. And she's the same godmother who sent me Dylan Thomas's A Child's Christmas in Wales when I was 12. What She Left for Clarissa Lambourne. A whale's tooth decorated with a ship. A derby figure of Britannia carrying oak leaves. A rustic Thompson table complete with carved mouse. A glass bowler hat in which upended she kept her keys. A satinwood desk with honeywood glow, at which she sat to write to her 2 friends. 3 Worcester bowls from a dessert service, maroon, gilt-edged, with exotic birds at the centre. Matron ordered the room cleared by noon. Thank you.